Good morning, participants. It's a pleasant sunny morning, and my name is Ridhiman Sarkar. I'm from the admissions office of Jindal School of International Affairs. I welcome you all to Jindal School of International Affairs webinar series 2020. I hope you all are safe and doing well. The topic of today's webinar is is politics gender neutral? And indeed, it's an interesting topic that we would be discussing today. And it will be presented by Professor Dr. Rafaela. She is an associate professor at Jindal School of International Affairs. Post the presentation from Professor Rafaela, we will take questions. She would be answering to questions related to the subject, and I would be happy to answer any non-academic questions. I now hand over the session to Professor Rafaela. She would continue and start with her presentation. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Now, I have organized some PPTs, which also give you an idea of how normally I organize the class. So the topic of today is politics gender neutral, and I choose this topic because, again, there is a lot of debate in terms of whether we should also include gender, how important is gender when we look at politics, but also what is gender. Normally, the first slide that I use is I highlight the key point that I'm going to look at during the class. And these are the key points. So is politics a science? Again, if we're looking whether politics is gender neutral, we also need to understand how we look at politics, how we do science. So the first question is politics a science? And if it is a science, it is gender neutral. How important is gender within science? Then the second question that we need to look at is how do scientists create science? Then we will move to looking at women and politics, and especially why women have been traditionally excluded from politics, with the idea that politics is a man's world. And then I will just briefly explain what is gender, what is the meaning of gender, and give an example using international relations. So the example will be on war. So how the image that we have on war also have an impact in the way we understand gender. So let's start. How is science made? So when we talk of science, when we talk of political science, when we talk of the knowledge that we have on science, there is the idea that science has to be impartial and objective. So it means that science should apply to everyone. We need to look at phenomena objectively, but also the scientists need to ensure that the way they look at events, they look at phenomena, have to be impartial. So in that sense, doesn't matter which gender you are, which background you come from. But then the question is, if we accept this, that science should be impartial and objective, the question is, how do we achieve this impartiality and objectivity? And especially this question is relevant because we need to recognize that the community of experts, the academic, create knowledge, but they are also human beings. And because they are human beings, they also can make mistakes. So how we guarantee this impartiality and objectivity? The answer when we look at science is that the community of experts, the academics, will use scientific method. What does that mean? That normally there are particular steps they have to follow. They observe a specific phenomenon or event that can be anything. For instance, why war happened. So in that sense, they look at war, what are the character of war, or maybe they can look at, for instance, integration, how different communities integrate. So in that sense, they observe what happens, the dynamic of integration, the dynamic of war. Then the next step will be to collect information of that particular event, phenomenon. In some cases also they use information about also past event in order to be able to compare what is happening now with what is happening in the past. And then in some cases they conduct experiments. This is especially the case in natural science, but also experiment can be conducted when we look at political science. Then the final step is also to explain and understand those data, in the sense that it is not enough to observe a phenomenon and collect data. The question is also very important to understand and explain those data, because data do not speak by themselves. And then the final step will be to arrive to a conclusion. So either, for instance, validate past theory or perhaps create a new theory. So these are normally considered the key step to achieve science through a scientific method. And again, if we look at all these steps, it looks like that it is possible to create science impartially and objective. And then let's move to the next slide. Are scientists objective? The quick answer will be no. They are not objective. And how do we know that actually scientists are not objective? Because if we look at theory, we need to recognize that theory have changed over time. And here we can give example of apartheid, slave, colonialism. All these theory have changed over time. Even when we look at gender up to 50 years ago, for instance, was not even considered. So there are event, phenomenon, and theory that, for instance, now are new in the sense that before they were not studied, not because that event were not important, but because scientists, for instance, were not looking at those events. But when we say that scientists are not objective, even if they follow what we call the scientific method, is because scientists observe particular event or phenomenon from a very specific standpoint. So we need to recognize that race, ethnicity, class, gender, but also nationality, power relation, and dominant discourse shape the way in which scientists observe phenomena. So in that sense, science is neither objective nor universal in the sense that apply everywhere to all the time, or neutral. But again, the problem is then if science is not objective and not neutral, why we keep talking of science? Why we keep talking of political science? Because still, we need to recognize that scientists do their best in order to collect information, to analyze those information. But of course, we need to recognize at the same time their position, their background, if they race, their ethnicity, but also if they come from a rich class, the nationality where they come from make a difference. An easy example can be, for instance, when we look at war. Let's take, for instance, the war on Iraq. So, for instance, American scholars were, of course, looking from American perspective, US perspective. So, for instance, when they were looking at war, they were looking at counting the death, but they were counting the soldiers, American soldiers, which were dying in that war. So the image and the information, the event they took from that example was strictly from American perspective. And of course, this was a different, the perspective of Iraqi people was completely different. What does that mean? That even if we look at the same event, different people have a specific perspective. And again, this comes from where we stand. And if you notice, there are many elements that are important in this. And one of these elements is also gender. And this is why when we say that political science is not gender neutral, is because also who we are, what is our gender have an impact on the way we look at particular event. So to conclude the part of science, we need to recognize that science is the expression of specific interests. That could be, for instance, the community of scientists, but also politicians, institutions, some group of the society have the interest of looking at particular phenomena or event in a very specific way. As I said, if we use example of slavery, apartheid, race, caste, all these examples tell us that the idea that we have 50 years ago, 1 century ago, are completely different from the way we look at this element today. Moving on, and I guess I hope I'm not too fast. So science is a social construct. What does that mean? It means that even if we define science as something objective, it is the result of a social construct. It's constructed by society. It is created by society, by all of us, again, mostly from the community of scientists. So when we look at science, we need to make an important distinction. When we say that the world is out there, in the sense that, yes, there are phenomena outside, like when we look at war, when we look at ethnicity, when we look at race, that needs to be analyzed. But to say that the world is out there for us to analyze, to interpret, to observe, is very different to say that the truth is out there. Whatever event we observe, we need also to interpret those events. And because we interpret that event, we are not necessarily arriving to truth. The same event could be looked from different perspectives. Again, from people from different classes, from scientists coming from different countries. And that they might have a complete different approach. They might look at the event differently. So we need to recognize that whatever event we look at, we have to interpret and understand those events. And here I put a quotation from Robert Cox, which is a well-known US academic in international relations. And this is a sentence that he made: theory is always for someone and for some purpose. And it is very important to understand this. So when we look at political science as well, we need to recognize that some of the ideas that excluded, for instance, women, are the result of also of theory that was created by someone, in this case, men scientists, but also for some purpose. If we take example from international relations, then we can think of, for instance, great power, how great power was justified, how war have been justified by strong state. If we think of liberalism, free market, even globalization, I mean, these are all Western theory and how they have been created, but also how they are impacting, for instance, the global South. And from the way this theory have been created, we can see that the theory is done by someone, in this case, the West, but also the purpose is really to impose this idea all over the world, even if in some countries this idea actually should not apply on. Okay, now, having done a general overview of what is science, then we can move on to the question of women and politics. So why have women been traditionally excluded from politics? And the ground on exclusion, again, also used in theory, was that women should be excluded from politics because there are some natural differences between men and women. So when we look at politics, there is the idea that politics is about men. Masculinity is the ideal political behavior. Why? Because politics is about competition, is about aggression. A politician needs to be strong, needs to be rational, needs to be pragmatic. And all these skills are believed that are possessed only by men. Of course, we can say, well, but also women have been part of politics. It is true. But also, if we look at top women who have been involved into politics, they are not considered so much feminine in the sense that they have demonstrated that also they are strong, they are aggressive, they are rational. So in that sense, they are acting as if men. that these examples are also used to demonstrate that, again, there are natural differences, and if women would like to be part of politics, they have to behave as men. Because again, in politics, what matters is the concept of masculinity. So this is the perspective of men. What about women? Again, traditionally women tended to accept their feminine role as if a natural role. So the idea that women's role is within the family. As wife, as mother, they should take care of the family. So if men are competitive, aggressive, and rational, the image that we have from women's perspective is the complete opposite. Women are not rational, are emotional. Women are not aggressive. They care for the people. They protect the member of the family. So creating this idea of differences between what is men and what are women and what are the core character of them was used also scientifically to demonstrate that if we are talking of politics, especially international politics, we need to recognize that politics is about men being part of politics. It's about war. It's about tough relations. And so what feminists have done, especially from 1970, is try to criticize this idea. So they start from the premise that politics has been traditionally a men's war, but also that politicians are replicating men's power. And in doing this, they are just taking for granted that politics is not a place for women. So what feminists have advocated is that women's perspective needed to be added into politics. And especially they cannot take for granted that women have to be excluded because that image that we have on women in terms of caring people, in terms of emotional people, does not always apply. But also for men, not all men are competitive, not all men are aggressive. So when we talk of gender, we need to recognize that gender have a key role to play into politics. And then let's move on to the next slide. So why we talk of gender politics? And why is it important to recognize that gender have a role to play into politics? Because gender influences not only who we are, but also how we live, how we think, how we understand, and how we explain the social world. So talking about gender and gender politics means to talk about men and women. But when I say men and women, I mean that we need to look at how the concept of womanhood and manhood has been constructed. So what is the image that we have about men? What is the image that we have about women? But also how this idea have an impact in the way in which we produce politics. So when we talk of gender politics, we are also talking about masculinity, but we are also talking about femininity, and the two goes together. So we cannot understand what we mean to be a man without also having the idea what it means to be a woman. Why? Because traditionally Western political thought has been organized upon binary opposition, in the sense that they created the idea of men as rational, and the counterpart was that women were emotional. So in order to understand what it means to be strong, we also need to have the image of women as, for instance, weak, as the victims, men as the protector. So gender politics is about looking at construction, creation, how the society have created ideas, specific idea, what it means to be men and what it means to be women. So if we are going to give definition, we need to distinguish between sex and gender. So when we talk of sex, we are talking of the unchangeable anatomic character, the biological element. Again, I put unchangeable even if we need to recognize that today people can go also through surgery and can change their sex. But when we talk of sex, it's something natural, okay? When we talk of gender, it's something related to culture. So when we talk of gender, is the cultural meaning that we give to our body. So what does that mean? That each of us has a particular body, again, a female body or man body, but then the way we live that body, the way we appropriate ourselves of dominant norms, behavior, what is expected from that body is up to us, but also have a cultural element in the sense that it depends in which society we live. So when we say that men and women act differently, it's not because necessary of the biological difference in terms of sex, but we need to recognize the cultural and society meaning of sex, of gender. So that's why, so when we talk of sex, is natural. When we say natural, it means it comes from nature. We cannot change it. When we talk of gender, we need to recognize that gender is a social construct. It means that gender is constructed from society. And because it is constructed, it can also be changed. And if we look through history, we need to recognize that gender role through history has changed. So again, it depends on us, what we understand by be a woman and be a man. So gender, when we say gender politics, gender does not refer to the anatomic difference. So it's not about talking about the body of men and of women, but we are looking at how men and women learn how they should behave, learn what is the expectation from their society in terms of being men and women. And when we say we learn it, again, it is also the result of science which is connected to that. And I give an easy example, for instance, women have always traditionally been excluded from politics. And again, there has been many studies trying to explain why. And initially, all those studies were done, for instance, by men. They say, if we look at statistics, for instance, we recognize that women are not involved into politics. And those data are actually correct. But then the question is also to understand why are women excluded? So rather than taking data that demonstrate that women do not, for instance, participate into politics, feminists have tried also to look at other data in looking at, for instance, discrimination. Do women have access to politics? What are the expectations for women to be part of politics? And in that case, you understand the difference between the importance of gender in terms of expectation, in terms of construction. And then to move to the last slide, I put the example of war. Why? Because when we think of war, again, is really the key example of a phenomenon that relates to men. When we think of war, we think about aggression, about the courage and sacrifice of men. War is about killing and be killed. So the dominant image that we have about war is that it is men who go to war. It is men who are going to sacrifice themselves for the motherlands. They are prepared to be killed for the motherlands. And then we have the idea that women at the same time are the weak people that needs to be protected. They need to stay at home. So again, if we look at today, we know that in war, everyone is involved into war. So it is not only men who are prepared to die for the country. It is not only, women not necessarily want to stay at home. But if we look at the way we think of war, even the definition, for instance, of motherlands, the concept of motherlands invoke the image of a woman, the mother. But why is that? Because the image of the mother is also the image that the mother is the dearest person in the family. The mother is the one who protects its family. The mother is the one who cares for its family. And this concept, motherland, has been also used to project our country. When we think of our country, our motherland, we think that our country is able to protect us, to care for us. So what we have again, here we have, looking at war and conflict, there are some ideas that reproduce different gender identity, with the idea that men are looked as the hero, as the one being able to, willing to sacrifice themselves. Women are normally seen as the victims that needs to be protected. So when we look at mother, when we look at women, we think about love, we think about affection, we think about protection. We do not think of women in terms of women who have the courage to sacrifice the same, to fight, to sacrifice themselves and to fight for the country. So to conclude, looking at gender politics is about looking at the different way in which men and women have, their identity has been constructed, is looking about expectation and looking about how science partially have reproduced this idea. So to talk about gender politics is mostly about a critical analysis of past theory. So the idea that we need, in a sense, to dismantle, deconstruct past theory, which was mostly made by men, and recreate new theory and include the perspective of women. And including the perspective of women, then we have a bigger picture. And I will stop here, and I hope that the presentation was clear again, because I cannot see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yes, indeed, the presentation was clear, and I must admit, you very beautifully constructed and represented, the thought and the topic today. And before we start taking questions from the participants, from your presentation, I wanted to ask you a question, and then probably I will take up questions from the participants. My question to you would be, in Indian politics, generally we see it's always male dominated, and in recent past we have seen there are a lot of reservations that are given even at the grassroots level to women, wherein they are they're given these reservations to come up into this political arena. You talk about gram panchayat, you talk about the different segment of elections that happens in India. We see that these reservations are coming up. So what is your opinion? Do you think these reservations will help balance gender and will make it gender neutral?
Well, it's not about gender neutral in this case, will be more about gender equality. Now, the key question when we're looking at including women, for instance, into politics, as member, for instance, of the parliament, or more women involved in political parties. First, of course, the question is how we understand politics. So if we say that, for instance, politics is a man war, then we also acknowledge that if women are going to be part of politics, they need to act in the same way of men. So we need to forget about the idea of care, about peaceful relation, about emotion. If we recognize that politics is something, in politics, we need to be much more inclusive. And what is important in politics, both rationality and emotion. You cannot always be aggressive, but you also need to cooperate. Then we recognize that also we need women as well. Second question is in terms of gender equality. Now, if we recognize that each of us give a particular perspective, and we're not simply talking about men and women, also, for instance, people coming from a linguistic background, from particular race, from particular caste, all of them should be included into politics. Why? Because if the country have different community, those community in a democratic country should be part of that, because there is no one else that can represent them. So there is the idea that, again, if women have particular needs, they also should be represented by other women who have gone through a particular experience and they can understand them. So in other countries, what they have done, for instance, is ensure that there is a particular legislation in order to create quota. So it ensure that 20%, 30% of women are in the parliament. But again, before doing this, you also need to change in the way we think of politics, in the way we think of men, in the way we think of women. And only after that, you can really start building up the idea that if we are looking at inclusive politics, we need to consider all different groups. And women are also part of this group. Hello?
Thank you so much, Professor, for answering that. So now I move on to questions from the participants.
Okay.
Though your answer, it answers to some of the questions that the participants have put across, but still I would read out the questions to you. Like, historically speaking, has there been a conscious effort in terms of world politics to keep women out of politics?
Sorry, say again, if there has been some?
Was there, like, I'm talking about historically, was there been a conscious effort to keep women out of international politics?
Well, historically, women has been out of politics, both national politics and international politics. And this also goes with the theory, in the sense that if we go back to Aristotle, which is really considered like the first philosopher from Greek philosopher, he was the one really highlighting the difference between men and women. He was the one saying that women are not fit for politics, women are weak, women are not rational. So from that idea, this idea has been replicated. And so that was used to justify, again, why women are not part of politics.
All right. The next question would be, do powerful women in politics, for example, Angela Merkel, do anything different in order to be in that, amongst the top politicians in the world?
My answer will be no, in the sense that all the cases of women that we know into politics, including international politics, actually, they are demonstrated, they are acting as men. They need to be rational, they need to be strong, they need to look at career first rather than the family. So in that sense, the cases that we have on important women who have made politics, actually they are replicating the idea of manhood. In that sense, we do not have an image, also like Margaret Thatcher. We have this idea like Iron Woman, okay? Yes. So no, in that sense, no, not in politics. And this is precisely why it is important also to look at gender policies. It is important to understand that we need to break from this idea. And for instance, one example, with feminists, what they say that if men is about war, is about aggression, and we want to create a much more peaceful world, then, and if women are actually more peaceful, less aggressive than men, actually we should consider that including women, but not the aggressive part of women, the other part, the caring aspect, the cooperation, that women is able to do that.
Very well said, ma'am. The next question would be, how can LGBT community can increase their representation and participate more in politics?
Well, of course, there is a huge difference between countries. In some countries, you cannot even mention the word LGBT. You cannot mention, I mean, people cannot go out and define themselves as gay, lesbian, or queer. Again, these are new groups, I will say, for some country. In other countries like United States and Europe, there has been a lot of public campaign for the past 20 years. But still, we need to recognize that in many countries, religions still play a very important role. So when we, for instance, we talk of family, there is the idea that family is about men and women. So in that sense, there are many that believe that either you are female, okay, woman or men, and then you should just love the other sex. These issues are important because, again, they are all related to identity. They relate to the way in which we construct the society. When we talk of gender, I said that it is the socially learned behavior. So it means that when we talk of gender, we don't simply consider two sexes. Gender is about more than that, how we perceive our body. So in that sense, also our gender can be as lesbian, as a gay, as a queer. So it is identity by identity perception and how we live that. Again, if we are moving to, the question is again, what kind of politics do we want? Do we want an inclusive politics? Then we need to recognize that in our society, there are different groups with different identity. And in that sense, we need to break away from the past. If we want to continue with traditional politics, when men dominate, then there is nothing that actually, we are not opening up to new ideas, new experience, new identity.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm getting a lot of questions. We have time limitations, so I will take questions which are little unique and from what you have already answered. So I will take some, little out of the box questions. And I have a question here, and it's an interesting thought. Does reservations enough to bring in and end gender inequality in politics?
No, it is not, because gender inequality is the result of, again, particular norm, society, and tradition. And we need to recognize that most of tradition, most of culture are very traditional. So it is, again, important first to understand the difference, to understand the tradition, but also why we want to keep those traditions. So here is, again, when we are looking at women, to increase the number of women, it's not simply in terms of numbers. We also need to change the mentality of the people, and that starts from an early age. For instance, how we raise children, what kind of toys, for instance, we buy to them, how parents then replicate particular ideas of gender. So in politics, no. I mean, really, the question is, I mean, if I would use like a technical question, I say that we need to really deconstruct, so put into pieces, or imagine like Lego toy, okay? So when we construct a building, so this, when we think of theory is the same. So the theory of that women should be excluded from politics has been constructed in a very particular way. So really what we needed to dismantle piece by piece and recreated it again. So we need to start from the basic idea. Who are women? Who are men? What is our identity? And what kind of society we want to create? But again, it's not at the level of politics. We also need to start from the societies there where the problem is.
Thank you so much. I'll take two more questions. And we are getting a lot of questions, and I would request our participants to share those questions on email to us after the session, so that we don't miss out on these questions. We would be sending in revert on your email to answer all these questions. But the last two questions I would be taking today in this forum, the first one being, according to you, Professor, what do you consider to be the event that has actually worked towards gender equality in international politics?
Gender equality in international politics. Well, there has been major events.
What is the event?
The event, is it correct?
Yes.
Well, I mean, in international politics, at the academic level, everything started around end of 1780s. There has been several, women in academia, especially from the US, looking at women exclusion and why women have been excluded. If we're looking at everyday, let's say, politics, then again, we need to look back to the West, mostly from the 70s, when there has been a lot of like feminist movement, starting like when women started to go out. But if we are looking in terms of protest, I mean, women have been into politics much earlier. Think of the right to vote, for instance, both in the US and the UK. That was the result of a lot of fighting, really activism by women. Again, at the time was mostly educated women that, again, they challenged the idea of not being part of politics. So there is not one major event. But there has been, let's say, a few moments, again, with feminist movement, normally we go back to the First World War. Then Second World War was very important because most of the women, for instance, have been taking the job of men. So for the first time, they were working outside. And when the war finished, again, Western, we're talking of the West here, they realized that they could work as much, they were as able as men. Then in the 70s, there was much more like movement, feminist movement, but the focus was more like in terms of divorce, in terms of domestic violence, in terms of protection of women's body. So there are a lot of, let's say, topics that obviously concern women, and this has done, I mean, has have a slowly evolution.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the answer. The last question would be difference between feminism and liberal feminism in politics. You can also talk in terms of Indian politics, but on a whole, what's your opinion on that?
Okay, when we talk of feminism, there are many, let's say, school of thought, okay? So when we talk of liberal feminists, normally liberal feminists are those feminists who are talking about equality. So liberalism normally means about equality, about respect, about freedom. So liberal feminists also are looking at this. So the focus is mostly on the legal aspect. So what they are saying is that women are equal to men, and then we need to change the legislation in order to ensure this equality. So from a liberal perspective, they are looking at, again, the same principle of liberalism. So women equality, women equal opportunity in society. But liberal feminists are not the only one. We also have what they call radical feminists or Marxist feminists, for instance. They look much more a question of, like Marxist feminist question of exploitation. Again, taking the idea from Karl Marx. So they look at exploitation, marginalization, and economic aspects. So for instance, the subordination of women when we look at jobs. Then there are also other, so liberal, Marxist, radical feminists. Radical feminists are called radical because they believe that if we really want to have equality, we need to radically change the society. Again, we live in a very masculine society, patriarchal society. So in order to have equality, we need first to dismantle this. So it's not simply a question of adding women, adding some new law or norms in terms of equality, but if we do not change the society, these laws are not going to be as effective as we hope.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor. So we end the question and answer session as of now today. And I have one of the participants mentioning and giving credits to our efforts to conduct these webinars. He also, congratulate you on such an interesting topic, and it opens up so much of thought for us to, go back and, read more about these things. So thank you so much for the lovely presentation and your thoughts as well. As I said, we have a lot of questions still coming in, and due to time constraint, we would want these questions if you could just email it to me, and we will definitely revert back to you with our answers. And we also hope to keep in touch with you with different modules, wherein sitting at home right now, you can do little research about some interesting topics, share your thoughts with us, and if you want some reading materials and want to prepare before you want to join university, we can also help you out on those fronts as well. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you to all the participants and my colleagues who have joined the webinar today. We hope to come up with such innovative and interesting topics for you. So please keep an eye on your email. We will be sending you invites, and we want to see your participation to make this webinar series successful. Thank you once again, and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.